Chapter 1. The Divided Crown. Welcome back, one last time. There is still no rush here, and no test at the end. Only the long evening of a very long story, and the strange light that comes after. When we rested, the empire had survived its 50-year storm, walled its own capital, and was waiting, patched, armored, and exhausted, for someone to give it a design. Settle in then, and let the dusk begin gently. It has a long way to fall, and there is more gold in it than you may expect. The man the armies finally raised, in the usual way, in a frontier camp, over the body of the usual murdered predecessor, was the Balkan guardsman we met at the last part's close. Diocletian, said to have been a freedman's son from the Dalmatian coast, past 40, who had watched a generation of saviors die of the age and had drawn, watching, one large conclusion. The empire's sickness was not this invasion or that usurper. It was design, or rather the absence of one. A world state still improvising its very center, 3 centuries after Augustus, out of a mask, a bodyguard, and luck. Diocletian was not a great general. The age had had great generals by the dozen and buried them all. He was something the age had not tried. A great administrator with absolute power and, by the standards of his century, time. For he would reign 20 years, longer than any emperor since the Golden Afternoon, and he would spend them taking the entire Roman state apart and reassembling it, bolt by bolt, into something that could survive. Begin with his strangest and boldest repair, the one that names this chapter. He divided the crown on purpose. The lesson of the 50 years was that the empire was too large for one man. Every crisis at one end had bred a usurper at the other, because distant armies facing distant enemies would always, in the end, raise the commander they could see. Diocletian's answer was to make the usurpation official. He chose a trusted comrade, another Balkan soldier, and raised him to full co-emperor. 2 Augusti, one facing east, one west. Then, a few years on, he completed the design. Each Augustus adopted a junior emperor, a Caesar, again proven Balkan officers, to hold his other frontier and to be his designated heir. 4 rulers, 4 courts, 4 armies in chief, 1 college, with Diocletian its unquestioned senior. The scheme is called the Tetrarchy, the rule of 4, and for 20 years, held together by Diocletian's personal authority, it worked as nothing had worked in a century. Every frontier watched by an emperor, every victory the college's victory, usurpation starved of its oxygen. For what discontented army needed to make an emperor when 4 legitimate ones stood armed and adjacent? The empire stopped bleeding. Persia was beaten so soundly the eastern border held for generations. And notice, before we move on, what has quietly happened to the mask of Augustus. It has become an office, plural, appointive, almost bureaucratic, a thing of the state rather than of a family. The Republic's ghost, which Augustus had wrapped around one man's power, was being folded away at last. What replaced it was not a pretense, but a structure. And around the structure, Diocletian built the rest of the new Rome, and this series will render the reforms as what they felt like rather than as an administrator's list. The provinces, a few dozen sprawling since the Republic, were sliced into more than 100 small ones, grouped under new layers of oversight. No governor would ever again hold enough territory to dream. The army was split in 2 natures. Frontier troops settled thick along the rivers to absorb a blow, and new mobile field armies, cavalry heavy, held behind the lines to answer it. The ring, rebuilt with a spring in it. The taxes were remade around the crisis's own discovery, that when coin fails, the state must live on the land itself. A vast new census counted every field, vine, olive tree, and laboring body in the empire, and assessed each district in kind. Grain, cloth, remounts, recruits, a system rational, predictable, crushing, and inescapable, under which, over the coming century, more and more of the free countryside would be bound by law to its land and its trade. Plowmen's sons to the plow, bakers' sons to the ovens. The state, in its hunger for stability, slowly freezing the world in place. He even tried, notoriously, to freeze prices themselves. A great edict, posted across the empire on stone. Fragments survive today, fixing the lawful maximum for everything from a soldier's boots to a lion, on pain of death. Markets answered as markets do. Goods vanished, black markets bloomed, and the law, the sources admit, died of being ignored. A failure worth recording plainly, because it marks the honest limit of the new absolutism. The emperor could now count every olive tree in the world, and still could not command the price of eggs. But the deepest change was the one you would have felt in your knees. The soldier emperors of the crisis had been first among comrades, men you could approach, petition, glimpse at the parade ground. Diocletian, the freedman's son, deliberately ended all that. The emperor now withdrew behind ceremony of an Eastern sacral kind. The diadem and the robes sewn with gems, the court a choreography of ranks and veils. The imperial presence approached through chamberlains, in silence, and greeted not with a citizen's salute, but with adoration. Prostration, the hem of the robe kissed. The blunt old titles gave way. Where Augustus had insisted on princeps, first citizen, the address now was dominus, lord, master, the very word, this series remembers, that a slave used for his owner. In Roman belief, the emperors of the college stood under the special companionship of the greatest gods. Diocletian styled himself under Jupiter's patronage, his colleague under Hercules, not gods themselves quite while living, but no longer men among men either. Sacred figures, hedged with ritual, at the summit of a sacred order. Romans of the old caste might have gagged. Most Romans, after 50 years of watching approachable soldier emperors murdered by their own approachable soldiers, seem to have understood the point at once. Majesty was armor. Distance was a design feature. The first citizen was dead. Long live the Lord. The mask, to say it one last way, had become a crown, divided, jeweled, and held up out of reach. It is here, at the summit of the Restoration, that this reign turns to the page this series cannot and will not turn past quickly. Because the new order's logic had one more conclusion in it, and Diocletian, near the end of his 20 years, drew it. The new Rome was to be a single sacred structure, one design, one discipline, one piece with heaven underwriting it all. The Pax Deorum, restored by the College of Jupiter's and Hercules' men, as the official theology of the recovery itself. And standing visibly outside that structure, larger now than ever, grown all through the crisis, as we saw, organized, networked, led, were the Christians, whose belief forbade them the very gesture, a pinch of incense to the gods and the emperor's spirits, on which the whole sacred order turned. For nearly 2 generations, the empire had largely let the contradiction lie. In his last years, urged on, the sources say, by his junior colleague, though the responsibility was his own, Diocletian resolved it, and what followed is remembered by the Church as the Great Persecution, and receives here its plain and honest paragraph. Across a decade, in waves of edicts, the churches ordered demolished and the scriptures burned. Christians stripped of rank and legal standing. The clergy imprisoned wholesale. And at the last, the general order that all must sacrifice on pain of death. It was the most systematic attempt in Roman history to erase a faith, and its human record, the Church kept it, name by name, in the martyr rolls that were its counter-archive, includes executions in the arenas and the mines and the squares of the East in the thousands. It must also be recorded in this series' way of honest unevenness that the storm fell with wildly different weight across the college's 4 domains. Ferocious in the East under Diocletian and his successor there. Mild to nearly nominal in the far West, where the Caesar of Gaul and Britain hold his name a moment, burned some buildings, executed almost no one, and visibly let the thing lapse. And it failed. That is the plain historical verdict, visible within a single generation. The faith was too large now, too woven in, its neighbors too unwilling to inform, its martyrs dying publicly, calmly, on principle, winning more hearts. Hostile observers themselves noted than the edicts did. The last great defense of the old sacred order, prosecuted with the full machinery of the reformed state, ended by demonstrating to every watching mind in the empire that the machinery had met something it could not process. Remember that demonstration. The next reign is built on it. And then Diocletian did the thing that places him, for strangeness, beyond every other figure in this story. At the height of his power, in deliberate fulfillment of his own design, he retired. No emperor had ever abdicated. He summoned the ceremony, wept a little, the sources say, took off the purple in front of the army near the city where he had first been acclaimed, and went home to the Dalmatian coast, to a colossal fortified palace he had built for exactly this. Its walls today are the living heart of the city of Split, its streets full of cafes, and grew vegetables. When, a few years later, the college he had built began to crack and old colleagues wrote begging him to take back the purple and save it, he answered, "The anecdote is the best attested thing about his retirement, and this series would keep it even if it were not. That if they could see the cabbages he was growing with his own hands at Salona, they would not ask him to trade such happiness for the storms of power." Cincinnatus summoned back to the plow's own argument at the far end of the story. The man who had rebuilt absolute power, declining it twice, once by giving it up, once by refusing its return. He died in his bed by the sea, one of the very few emperors in a century and a half to die peacefully at all, and the only one to manage it by simply ceasing, first, to be emperor. The college did crack, of course. It had been held together by his seniority, not his design, and within a few years of his abdication, the 4 thrones had bred 6 claimants, and the old arithmetic of civil war was running again. We will let those years blur, as our custom is, down to the one thread that matters, because it leads directly to the second name of this chapter and to the turning of the whole series. The mild Caesar of the far west, the one who had let the persecution lapse, died at York, in Britain, on campaign. And his army, in the oldest reflex in this story, ignored every constitutional nicety of the college and acclaimed his son on the spot. The son's name was Constantine. He was in his early 30s, a proven soldier, ambitious past concealing, and across the following 6 years he fought his way, war by war, toward the center, until on an autumn day he stood with his army at the gates of Rome itself, facing a rival who held the city, with everything staked on one battle at the Tiber crossings north of the walls, by the Milvian Bridge. What happened on the eve of that battle This series will report with the exact care its rules require, because it may be the single most consequential religious claim in Roman history. And it is a claim. The Christian accounts, one from a tutor in Constantine's own household, writing within a few years, another from a bishop who says he had it from the emperor's own lips, under oath, decades later, differ in detail. In one, a dream instructing him to mark his soldiers' shields with a sign of Christ. In the other, a vision seen with the whole army, a cross of light athwart the afternoon sun, and words with it, "By this conquer," followed by the confirming dream. What is not in dispute is what followed. Constantine's men went into battle under an unfamiliar monogram, the first two Greek letters of Christ's name interlocked, and won it totally. His rival drowned in the Tiber, armor dragged, when the bridge of boats broke under his retreat. The river of this series, one is bound to note, receiving one more turning of the story. And Constantine entered Rome the next day as master of the West, crediting his victory, then and ever after, to the God of the Christians. Whether the sign was vision, dream, solar halo, later memory, or statecraft, this series does not pretend to know, and neither, honestly, does anyone. What history can verify is the belief and its consequences, and the consequences began within months, when the new master of the West and his Eastern colleague jointly proclaimed what tradition calls the Edict of Milan. Full legal toleration for the Christians, their confiscated property restored, their faith henceforth as lawful as any in the empire. The persecution was not merely over. The persecuted had, in the person of the Western emperor himself, arrived at the summit of the state. Understand precisely what Constantine did and did not do, because the difference matters for everything ahead. He did not make the empire Christian. The overwhelming majority of his subjects, and of his army, and of the Senate, still kept the old gods, and the old rites went on. He himself remained chief priest of the state religion, as every emperor was, and his coinage carried the unconquered sun beside the new monogram for years. What he did was throw the incalculable weight of imperial favor to one side of the scale, money and land to the churches, legal privileges and tax immunities to the clergy. The Christian Sunday made a public day of rest. Basilicas, the Roman word for a royal hall of law, now lent to a new kind of assembly, rising at imperial expense in Rome itself over the shrine where tradition placed the Apostle Peter's grave, on ground that had been a circus of Nero's, where this series watched a persecuted handful die 2 parts ago. The symmetry was not lost on the Christians, and this series will not pretend it is lost on the narrator. And when the young church, embracing its sudden fortune, promptly fell into a furious internal dispute over how, precisely, to speak of the Son's divinity, a controversy this series will keep at one sentence's length, Constantine did something no Roman ruler had ever conceived of doing for any cult. He summoned the bishops of the whole world, at state expense, over the state's roads, to a lakeside town called Nicaea, and sat among them while they argued the nature of God into a common creed. An emperor of Rome, presiding over the definition of doctrine, the Pax Deorum was being renegotiated with a different heaven, and the state, as ever, intended to hold the pen. One more foundation, and the chapter can end where the outline of this series always intended it to end. At first light, on the water, at the world's new center of gravity. For Constantine, having reunified the whole empire under himself alone, the Tetrarchy's survivors defeated one by one, the divided crown gathered back, for one reign onto a single head. drew from the century's whole experience the same conclusion Diocletian had drawn in his bones. Rome, the city, was no longer where the empire lived. The frontiers were the life now, and the east was the wealth. The old capital, a monument-crowded museum of the Republic's ghost, lay weeks from every decision that mattered. So he did what no Roman had dared. He built a rival. On the site of an old Greek town called Byzantium, set on a blunt triangular promontory where Europe leans closest to Asia, sea on two sides, a superb deep harbor on the third, commanding the straits through which all traffic between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean must pass. Defensible as almost nowhere on earth, he founded, with full ceremony, augurs and astrologers and Christian clergy all present at once, the age in a single scene, a new Rome, Senate, Forum, Palace, Hippodrome, Grain Fleet, and Dole, even 7 hills obligingly identified. A complete second capital, tax-favored and endowed until it filled. History would not call it New Rome for long. It would call it, after him, Constantinople, the city of Constantine, and it would stand as a capital, often the capital, of the Roman state for 1100 years after the founding. Longer, hold this, than the span from Romulus's legendary furrow to Constantine himself. When we planted our measuring stick 2 parts ago, one of the longest continuities of state, law, and imperial identity the world has ever known, this city is where the far end of the measurement will stand. We may picture the newborn city at first light, in the founder's last years. Dawn comes up out of Asia, across the strait, the water the Greeks called the ox ford, barely a mile of running silver between 2 continents, and takes the promontory point first. The new seawalls going gold. The harbor called the Golden Horn, living up to the name it had before the city did. Crowded already with grain ships riding at anchor and caiques threading between them. Gulls over the fish market. The smell of salt, tar, bread, and cut stone, for the whole city smells of cut stone. It is one vast building site, scaffolding on every skyline, columns and statuary arriving weekly by imperial requisition from the old cities of Greece and Asia, a capital being furnished, critics grumbled, out of the empire's attic. Up the slope from the water, the terraces catch the light in rising order. The hippodrome's long flank. The palace roofs, the porphyry column in the new forum, with the founder's statue on its summit facing the sunrise, crowned with rays like the sun's, while 2 streets away the masons set the courses of a great church, both true at once in this founder to the end. And down at the land walls, 1 wall's width, this first generation, the mighty triple line comes later. The morning traffic is already pouring in from Thrace. Marble carts, mule trains, officials, masons, bishops, the empire's ambition funneling through the gates of its own future. Old Rome, weeks to the west, wakes this same morning unaware that anything final has happened to her. Her forum still speaks. Her games still run. Her senate still convenes in the house Diocletian rebuilt for it. But the river of gold and grain and government has quietly changed its bed. From this reign forward, the empire's center of gravity sits here, on the Oxford, facing east, and when, far ahead of us, the west goes down into its long dusk, it will be, hold this too, against the grief to come, not the death of the Roman state, but the loss of one of its 2 halves. The other half is being born in this morning light, and it will bury everyone in this story, and very nearly the story itself. Constantine died in his new city's hinterland a few years on, receiving on his deathbed the baptism he had deferred his whole reign, laying aside the purple at the last for the white robe of the newly christened emperor to the final week, catechumen at the very end. The whole ambiguous transaction of his age enacted one last time on a single bed. The Senate of Old Rome, unbothered by any of it, deified him in the traditional manner. The Church of New Rome buried him in his own mausoleum, ringed, at his own design, by memorials of the 12 apostles, himself the 13th at their center. Both honors stood. No one seems to have found this strange, and that two theologies, one throne, everything overlapping, nothing yet decided, is the exact condition of the empire he left. A Roman world still, by great majority, keeping faith with the old gods in the old way, now governed from a Christian court, under a dynasty pledged to the new. The temples open and the churches rising, the Pax Deorum and the gospel both, so to speak, on retainer. That condition could not hold, and the story of how it broke, quietly over 3 generations, in law courts and Senate debates and the extinguishing of a very old flame, is the next chapter. The 4th century's soft, vast revolution, when the old gods of this whole long series were, one by one, shown the door of the world they had built. Chapter 2. The New Faith and the Old Gods. This chapter must do the gentlest large thing in the whole series. It must watch one religious world set and another rise, over about 3 human generations, without pretending the change was simple, bloodless, total, or, in either direction, a morality play. Rome does not convert in a thunderclap. There is no single day. There is, instead, a long twilight hour in which both lights are in the sky at once, the altars still smoking and the vigil candles already lit. And this chapter is that hour. We will keep, throughout it, the promise made in this series' very design. Christian belief framed as belief, Roman belief framed as belief, the narrator's own voice belonging to neither and honest about both. And we will keep our eyes, as the outline of this series insisted, on Rome, on law, stone, ceremony, the city, and daily life. Because that is where the revolution actually happened. Not in heaven, where this series claims no sight, but in the world, where it changed everything it touched and kept, strangely, almost everything it replaced. Begin with the pace of it, because the pace is the first surprise. Constantine's sons ruled Christian. The laws began, decade by decade, to lean. An edict against sacrifice here, indulgently unenforced. Temple treasures inventoried there. The old subsidies quietly starved. And yet, a full generation after Milvian Bridge, the old religion still commanded the great majority of the empire. The countryside almost untouched, the army mixed, the Senate of Rome overwhelmingly faithful to the gods of its ancestors, the temples open, the games running under the old calendar, the Vestals tending their fire exactly as they had for 1,000 years. Conversion ran fastest where the empire was most modern. The cities, the eastern provinces, the civil service, wherever imperial favor shone and careers were made. Slowest where the world was oldest. The Latin word paganus meant a country dweller, a villager, and could also mean a civilian, as against a soldier. And by whichever road the word traveled, scholars still argue the route. The Christian's name for the old religion's followers became, and in every Western language remains, exactly that. Pagans. In the likeliest telling, the village people. The ones out beyond the new lights. A whole religious revolution is fossilized in the etymology. The new faith took the cities, the court, and the future first, and named its rival after the places that held out. The old faith even got its restoration. One brief, extraordinary reign, a generation after Constantine, which this series will hold to its custom and leave unnamed while giving it its due. A nephew of the great house, raised Christian, orphaned by his Christian kin's own dynastic murders, secretly in love since boyhood with the old books, the old gods, and the old Greece, came to the purple by accident of war and death, and threw off the mask at once, the last pagan to rule the Roman world. History names him Julian, the Church's tradition, less kindly, Julian the Apostate, the backslider. This series sets the title down at arm's length and keeps the man. He was, the sources of both sides agree, brilliant, austere, workaholic, and strange, a philosopher-emperor out of season, scribbling satires and theology between audits. He reopened temples, restored sacrifices, purged the court's gilded excess, tried to build the old religion a church-like structure of charity and clergy it had never had, paying the new faith the immense compliment of imitation, and barred Christians from teaching the classics, a stroke his own pagan admirers winced at. And then, 18 months in, leading a grand invasion of Persia, he took a spear through the ribs in a cavalry skirmish and died in his tent at 31. The Restoration dying with him. The Church's later legend gave him dying words conceding victory to Christ, which this series records as what it is, the winners writing the exit line. The army, needing an emperor by morning, raised a Christian officer. The laws resumed their lean, and the old world had spent its last reign. What the episode proved, though, cuts both ways, and honesty keeps both. That the old religion still had fire enough, at the right spark, to take back the summit of the state. And that one reign was all the fire. At the state's summit, there was. For the drift resumed, and now we can watch it where this series has always watched power, in the forum's voice. In the Senate House at Rome, there stood, since Augustus's day, an altar and statue of victory, the winged goddess at whose altar for 4 centuries senators had sworn their oaths and offered incense before every session. The old religion not as belief merely, but as the very furniture of the state's speech. Christian emperors removed it. A pagan interlude restored it. Removed again, it became, late in the century, the object of perhaps the most famous religious debate Rome ever held, conducted, fittingly, entirely in writing, between 2 masters of the old rhetorical art. For the altar spoke Rome's most distinguished pagan, an aged senator of immense dignity, prefect of the city, whose petition survives entire and stands among the noblest things late antiquity wrote. Give back, he pleaded in substance, the altar under which our fathers drove out Hannibal. Grant the old ways the reverence due to age itself. We all look up at the same stars, share one sky, one earth. What does it matter by which wisdom each of us seeks the truth? Not by one road alone can we arrive at so great a mystery. Against him wrote the Bishop of Milan, the most formidable churchman of the age, a former governor drafted to the episcopate by popular acclaim, of whom more shortly, cold, brilliant, and immovable. The emperor is Christian. The state's money and the state's altar cannot serve gods the emperor knows to be nothing. Antiquity is not truth. The martyrs, too, are ancestors. The emperor ruled for the bishop. The altar never returned. And this series marks the moment for what it was in our long story. The forum's voice, which we have followed from a drained marsh, through Cicero's severed hands, to this, turned, in its old age, to arguing about which heaven it spoke under, and the plea that lost, the one road and the many, would echo for the rest of history, raised again in every age that has had to share a sky. The emperor who ruled for the bishop is the one name this chapter will carry. Theodosius, a Spanish soldier raised to the purple in catastrophe. The empire's eastern field army had just been destroyed by the Goths. That story belongs to the next chapter, and we hold it there. The last man who would ever rule the whole empire, east and west together, and the ruler under whom the long lean of the laws became, at last, a decision. In his reign, the edicts came in ranks and were meant. The Nicene Creed made the test of lawful Christianity, the state now defining orthodoxy inside the new faith even as it disestablished the old. Sacrifice banned outright, public and private. The temples closed to cult. Some converted, some abandoned to the weather. Some in ugly local episodes the emperor did not order and did not much punish. Sacked by monk-led mobs, the great Serapeum of Alexandria, one of the wonders of the ancient world, pulled down by such a crowd in his reign. An act this series records with the plainness it gives all destruction, whoever's God it serves. The old priesthoods were stripped of their immunities and revenues. The Olympic Games, 1,000 years of the old world's sacred athletics, guttered out within a generation of his laws. And in Rome, on a day tradition places late in his reign, officials came at last to the small round temple by the Forum, where the fire of Vesta had been tended in unbroken shifts since before the Republic was born, and put it out. This series planted that flame in its second chapter, and owes it a paragraph of its own now, in the old belief's own register. For in Roman belief, remember, the hearth of Vesta was the hearth of the state itself. As long as the fire burned, Rome stood. Its keepers, the 6 Vestals, were the most honored women in the Roman world, 30-year virgins of the flame whose persons were inviolable, whose word freed prisoners, whose care held, Romans believed, the pledges of Rome's eternity. The college was disbanded by the same laws. The last Vestals dispersed into a world with no category for them. And the fire that had outlasted kings, Gauls, Hannibal, civil wars, fires, plagues, and every crisis this series has narrated, went dark by administrative order in the reign of a Christian Spaniard, roughly 1,000 years after it was first lit. No army had ever managed it. The pagans of Rome said, quietly now, for the laws were listening, that the city's luck went out with it, and asked those who doubted to wait a very short while and watch the news from the north. This series does not traffic in omens. It reports, as always, what was believed, and notes only that the next chapter of this story is called The World Grows Cold, and that the pagans of Rome would not have been surprised by one page of it. Yet the fuller truth of the revolution, and here this chapter earns its title, is that the new faith did not so much demolish the old Roman world as move into it, room by room, keeping the furniture. Watch the inheritance, item by item, because we will meet all of it again in the legacy chapters at the series end. The new congregations needed halls. They took the basilica, the Roman law court form, the nave and aisles and apse where the magistrate had sat, and set the altar where the judge's chair had been. To this day, the world's cathedrals are Roman courtrooms, architecturally speaking, and the word basilica never changed. The church needed organization. It took the empire's own map, its provinces and dioceses, its metropolitan cities, so exactly that the ecclesiastical geography of Europe tonight still traces, diocese by diocese, the administrative Rome of Diocletian. It needed a language of government in the West, and took Latin, law Latin, chancery Latin, The tongue this series has watched, since it was scratched onto 12 tables, now carried into a future its makers never imagined. Its bishops, drawn increasingly from the same senatorial families that had once supplied consuls and prefects, stepped, especially in the West, as the civil order weakened, into the town patron's ancient role, feeding the poor from estates, ransoming captives, facing down governors and soon warlords, the toga's authority passing, in city after city, to the vestment. Even the titles traveled. The old chief priesthood of the state religion, Pontifex Maximus, borne by every emperor from Augustus to this chapter's generation, was finally dropped by the Christian emperors and picked up, in the fullness of time, by the bishops of Rome, who bear it still. The old religion's calendar of festivals thinned, and the new calendar of saints and seasons thickened along its grain, midwinter answering midwinter, harvest answering harvest. The crossroad shrines gave way to wayside chapels at the same crossroads. None of this, framed in this series' careful voice, decides any question of truth between the faiths, and is not meant to. What it establishes is continuity of another kind. That Rome, as a way of organizing space, law, language, charity, and the year, survived its own gods. That the vessel outlived the first cargo. Hold that thought through everything that is coming, because when the Western state itself goes down, 2 chapters from now, this, the church shaped like the empire, is the ark a great deal of Rome will ride out on. Honesty requires one more entry before the chapter's evening scene, and this series makes it without relish and without exemption. Power did to the new faith's rulers what power does. The persecuted of Nero's gardens and Diocletian's edicts became, within 3 generations of their victory, occasional persecutors in their turn. Of the old religion, as we have seen. Of Jews, whose synagogues began to burn in ugly incidents that emperors were bullied out of punishing. And of one another, for the state's embrace of one creed made every rival creed a legal as well as theological enemy, and Christian coercion of Christians, exiled bishops, riotous successions, doctrine enforced by prefects, became a standing feature of the age, and the era's single most instructive scene on the new arrangement of powers belongs here, told plainly. In Theodosius's reign, a mob in Thessalonica lynched an imperial garrison commander. The emperor, in a rage he shortly countermanded, too late by design or accident for the countermand to arrive, authorized reprisal, and his soldiers, sealing the city's circus at the games, massacred the crowd indiscriminately. The ancient figure, unverifiable and unforgotten, is 7,000 dead in an afternoon. It receives here the honest paragraph this series gives every such crime, emperor's faith notwithstanding. Thousands of ordinary people, gathered for the races, killed by the state for a mob's act, in an atrocity that shocked even that hardened century. What followed had never happened in Roman history. The Bishop of Milan, the same immovable man of the victory debate, wrote privately to his emperor that he could not offer the sacrifice of the altar in his presence until he had done public penance. And Theodosius, master of the Roman world, yielded, set aside the diadem and the purple, and stood among the penitents of the Milan cathedral, weeping, the sources say, until his bishop restored him at Christmas. In Roman belief across 1,000 years of this story, no one, no augur, no pontiff, not the Vestals themselves, had ever possessed standing to bar an emperor from the presence of the gods. The Pax Deorum had no clause above the ruler, for the ruler kept it. Something genuinely new had entered the world's politics in that cathedral doorway, an authority claiming to bind the crown itself from outside the state in the name of heaven, and the crown, for the first time, bowing to it. The medieval millennium, kings and popes, thrones and altars, 1,000 years of that argument, walked into history through that door, and this series simply points at the doorway and lets you hear the hinge turn. Now let the chapter keep its outlines promise, and end not with laws or emperors, but with 2 evenings side by side, given equal light. For somewhere in this long twilight generation, both of these evenings truly happened, in their thousands, and this series will imagine one of each with the same care. We may picture first the last evening of a small temple, not one of the famous ones, a country shrine of Diana, say, in the hills a day above Rome, in the years when the laws have closed, but not yet demolished. The priest is old. The priesthood has been his family's since anyone's memory, and there will be no successor, and he knows it. He comes up the path at dusk, as he has come 10,000 evenings, past the spring and the votive tree hung with generations of small offerings, a carved doe, a child's fever charm, ribbons gone gray, unlocks the cellar door, and does, one more time, everything correctly. Because in the old belief correctness was the whole art, sweeps the threshold, trims and fills the lamp before the image, offers the meal cake and the wine with the exact old words, his head covered, his voice low, no slip of the tongue in 60 years. The goddess looks over his head into the dark, as she always has. He is not defiant. There is no one to defy. The village below has a new chapel, and mostly goes to it, though some still climb here quietly on the old days. And he does not ask heaven for the world back. He asks, in the old contractual manner, only that the accounts be known to be in order, that whatever is owed on his side has been paid, evening upon evening, to the last. Then he banks the lamp low, enough oil till morning. It has never gone out on his watch, locks the door, and goes down the path in the dark, and the small light behind him burns on in the empty shrine, keeping, to no audience at all, the oldest appointment in this story. And we may picture, the same night, in the town in the valley, the great vigil of Easter, the new faith's oldest and most solemn night, kept then in forms a modern visitor would half recognize. Full dark, the congregation gathered outside the basilica doors, the law court doors, around a new fire struck from flint. The deacon lights the great candle from it and leads them in, and the fire passes hand to hand down the nave, taper to taper, until the borrowed courtroom is a lake of small flames under the bare beams, and the long readings begin. The world's creation, the sea parted, the dry bones standing. The whole story, as the new faith tells it, rehearsed annually in one night. The way this series rehearses its own. Toward the deep of the night, the catechumens are called, those who have spent the year or years preparing. The widow, the cobbler, the magistrate's daughter, the freedman, and are led away to the octagonal font house beside the basilica, where by lamplight facing west, they renounce the old gods aloud, each by their own voice. Then, facing east, profess the creed, and go down, one by one, into the water, under, in the old rite, fully under, dying to one world, the belief holds, and surfacing to another, and are lifted out gasping, wrapped in white, anointed, and led back through the doors into the full blaze of the vigil, where the whole congregation turns to receive them, the newest Romans of the new Rome, as the first gray of the resurrection morning comes into the clerestory windows. Joy is the note the old accounts insist on. Tears, embraces, the kiss of peace passed down the rows. Ordinary people, the same stock this series has loved in tenements and market towns, sure tonight in their belief that death itself has been unlocked. 2 lamps, 1 night, a valley apart, the banked flame keeping the old accounts to an empty room, and the past flame filling a courtroom with the newly reborn. This series, by its charter, holds both in the same steady light and calls neither true nor false. It says only what history can say, that the second flame was the future, and the first was owed, at minimum, a witness at its going, and that both were carried by Romans, in Roman lamps, up Roman roads. The gods changed. The oil, the roads, the lamps, the longing, the human thing itself, did not. And now the bill for the century comes due, for while the empire argued about heaven, the earth to the north of it was moving. Whole peoples were in motion out beyond the rivers, driven by a terror out of the deep steppe, with a name Rome had not yet learned to fear. The Danube frontier, 400 years the ring's strong shoulder, was about to face not a raid, but a migration. Nations, with their wagons and children, asking in numbers no one had ever processed. And the empire's answers, greedy, panicked, brutal, and improvised, were about to buy it the worst military catastrophe since Cannae, and open the road that ends, 30 years on, at the gates of Rome herself. The world is about to grow cold. Draw the blanket up, and let us go north. Chapter 3, The World Grows Cold. Every long story earns, somewhere, a chapter its listeners would rather not reach, and this is Rome's. The chapter where the news, after so many recoveries, stops getting better. We will keep through it all the disciplines this series has kept. The distance, the honest paragraphs, the refusal of spectacle, and one discipline more, stated now at the door. Grief without despair. Terrible things are coming, and they are endings. But the people inside them did not know they were living in an ending, and mostly they were not. They were living in a Tuesday, as people always are. And we will keep faith with their Tuesdays to the last page. Begin with a word, because the outline of this series has been holding a debt about it since part 1. And this is the chapter where it falls due. The peoples beyond the rivers, the Goths and their neighbors, whom this chapter is about, were called by the Romans barbarians, and the word will not be this narrator's. So let us take it apart once, properly, and set it down. It was a Greek word first, and at bottom a joke about sound. Barbar, the babble of those whose speech one has not troubled to learn. Rome inherited it as a boundary marker. Inside the word lived everyone outside the empire, and like all such words, it flattered its users and flattened its objects. The actual peoples it flattened, by this era, looked like this. Farming and herding nations, ironworking, goldworking. Their craftsmanship fills museum cases today and stops visitors cold. Organized under kings and assemblies, bound by elaborate law codes of oath and kin and compensation. Long entangled with Rome, not sealed off from her, trading across the rivers for generations, drinking Roman wine, wearing Roman brooches, and serving by the 100,000 across this century in Rome's own armies, where their officers rose, by this chapter's decades, to the very top. The Western Empire's best generals, for its whole last century, were men the word barbarian was built to exclude. Many of the Goths, by the time our story reaches them, were also Christians, converted a generation earlier by one of their own. a Gothic bishop who built them an alphabet and translated the scriptures into their tongue. The earliest substantial surviving text in any Germanic language. Though Christians, as the age's luck would have it, of the creed the empire had just ruled heretical, a difference that would poison much that followed. Hold all of that against the word, every time this chapter is forced to report the Romans using it, and hold too the honest other side, that these were also warrior societies, that their comings were often violent, and that the people in their path suffered terribly and are owed their paragraphs too. Complexity as ever in this series, in both columns. Now the terror that set them moving. Out of the deep steppe, in the years just after the pagan restoration failed, came a people even the frontier nations spoke of with dread. The Huns, mounted archers of the great grasslands, of a mobility and a pressure the river world had never met on this scale, before whom the easternmost Gothic realms broke within a few seasons. This series will not do to the Huns what Rome did to the Goths. They too were a people, with their own order and their own story, and we will meet them properly, and at their most formidable, in the next chapter. For now, what matters is the shock wave they pushed ahead of them, because in a single year, that shock wave arrived on the Danube in the form this series has been building toward for 2 chapters. Not an army, a nation. The greater part of the Gothic people, the ancient sources' guesses run to 100,000 and more. Wagons, herds, children, the old, stood on the far bank of the empire's river asking, formally and desperately, to be let in. Asking for lands to farm in return for military service, the very bargain Rome had struck profitably with settlers for centuries. The Eastern Emperor, his army committed on the Persian front, said yes, and then the empire, at the point of actual contact, did the thing that this series must record as the true beginning of the Western catastrophe, because the Romans' own historian of the age records it in exactly that spirit. The crossing was bungled, and the reception was vile. The officials on the ground, corrupt, contemptuous, and unprepared for the numbers, herded the refugees into holding camps and starved them there, selling them food at famine prices, and then dog's flesh at the price of children. The sources are specific, and this series will be too, once. Gothic parents sold their children into slavery for dog meat, at the hands of imperial officers enriching themselves on a humanitarian catastrophe of their own making. When the Goths inevitably rose, the local commander attempted to solve the problem by murdering their leaders at a banquet, failed, and lit the war. It receives its plain sentence in the ledger. The ruin that follows was not fated at the river. It was purchased, in the first instance, by greed and cruelty on the Roman side of it, and Rome's last great historian said as much before this series did. 2 years of that war later came the day the old military world ended. The Eastern Emperor, brave, impatient, and unwilling to share a victory he believed easy, brought the great Eastern Field Army to battle against the Gothic wagon camp near the city of Adrianople, a long, hot August day's march from Constantinople itself, declining to wait for the Western Army marching to join him. This series renders battles in outcome, and the outcome was this. Through the mistakes of a burning afternoon, the Roman army of the East, the senior force of the empire, the institutional descendant of everything this series has meant by the legions, was enveloped and destroyed. 2/3 of it did not leave the field. The largest Roman military catastrophe since Cannae, 6.5 centuries before. The comparison is the ancient historian's own, with this difference, which every thinking Roman grasped at once. After Cannae, the Republic's deep well had raised new legions within the year. There was no deep well now. The dead of Adrianople, the trained, equipped, irreplaceable professional corps of Eastern Rome, could not be conscripted back out of a countryside of tied tenants and tax flight. The gap they left was filled because it could only be filled by treaty with the victors. The Goths settled inside the empire on Roman soil under their own kings and their own law, as allies in name and an armed independent nation, in fact. The first such people ever planted on this scale, whole and unbroken, inside the ring. The emperor himself died on the field. His body was never found. The tradition that he burned in a farmhouse where he lay wounded is exactly that, a tradition. And the empire passed to the Spanish soldier of our last chapter, who made the Gothic treaty because there was nothing else to make, and spent his reign holding the settlement together by force of person. When he died, the last ruler of the United Empire, 20 years almost to the season after Adrianople, the whole arrangement was holding by his fingers, and the empire was divided, for the last time and forever, between his two young sons. East and West, Constantinople and the court of Italy. Brothers in name, rivals in fact, each half now walking its own road. The word Rome, from this page of the series forward, means two things, and the reader of the far future knows, as no one in that funeral procession did, which of the two roads runs another 1,000 years, and which runs 80. On the western road, the first to walk was a king. Alaric was a Goth of the settlement generation, raised inside the empire the treaty had opened, a Roman officer by career, commanding Gothic troops in Roman service, present, the reasonable inference of the sources, at the great battles the settlement's warriors won for Theodosius, where they were spent. Gothic voices complained ever after, more freely than Roman blood. He was, in other words, hold this because the whole tragedy lives in it, not an invader from the outer dark. He was the empire's own creation, a product of its army, its politics, and its broken promises, and what he wanted, through 2 decades of maneuver, was not Rome's destruction, but a place in it. A generalship of the first rank, lands and standing for his people, the settlement made permanent and honorable, asked for again and again, granted, revoked, renegotiated, and betrayed, as the Western court. Barricaded now in the marsh-ringed city of Ravenna, near the head of the Adriatic, behind lagoons no army could cross, cycled through intrigues, and the one Western general who could match him, a soldier of half-Vandal blood, the last great commander of the West, this series lets his name dissolve, fought him, dealt with him, and was finally executed by his own paranoid court. Whereupon the court, for good measure, permitted a pogrom of the families of its own Gothic soldiers, driving 30,000 of its best troops straight into Alaric's camp. Thus, armed by his enemies and denied by them one time past the last time, Alaric marched on the one asset the marsh city could not protect, and could not, he judged, endure to lose. The old capital itself, and put Rome under siege. He besieged her, in fact, 3 times across 2 years, and twice was bought off or drawn off into fresh negotiation. This series notes the pattern. because it is the fact that acquits the ending of premeditation. At nearly any point, the price of a title and a province would have sent him away. The third time, in the late summer of the year we count as 410 after the birth of Christ, more than 16 centuries ago now, and the one date this chapter will fix, a gate was opened in the night. Treachery, terror, or an inside sympathy no one ever established. The Salarian Gate this series cannot help noting, where the old salt road of our very first chapter entered the city. And for the first time in 800 years, since the raiders from the north whom Part 1 dispatched in a phrase, before the Republic's story had properly begun, a foreign army was inside Rome. The sack itself receives this series' full honest paragraph, and the honesty cuts in an unexpected direction. As sacks of great cities go, and this series has narrated Carthage, Corinth, and Jerusalem, the sack of Rome was materially restrained. 3 days, the Gothic king ordering, the Christian historians make much of it, and the pagan ones concede it, that the great basilicas of Peter and Paul be sanctuaries, unviolated, and that those who fled to them be spared. The city plundered hard, but not burned wholesale, its people robbed and terrorized, but not massacred in the manner of Carthage. There was killing, and there were atrocities, and there were captives marched away. This paragraph does not launder, and among the captives, hold her name, was the emperor's own sister, Galla Placidia, a young woman carried out of the falling city in the baggage of the Gothic army, of whom this series will have much to say. But the wound of 410, and this is the finding the whole ancient world came to within weeks, was never really the plunder. It was the meaning. Rome, the city that had taken the world, unarmed now, museum and mother, but Rome could fall. The news ran out across the empire like cold water through a house. In Bethlehem, at the far eastern end of the Roman earth, the aged scholar Jerome, translator of the scriptures into Latin, working in his cell by the Nativity Grotto, set down the words this series reaches for as its documented voice, because no narrator should try to improve them. The city which had captured the whole world, he wrote to a friend in substance, was itself captured. His voice stuck in his throat, he said. Sobs choked his dictation. If Rome can perish? He asked, an old man in another country, who had every theological reason to say otherwise. What can be safe? The pagans of Rome had their answer ready, and it was the one this series promised, last chapter, they would give. The fire of Vesta was out. The altars were cold. The gods, unfed for a generation, had lifted the 1,000-year protection. 410 followed the extinguishing as debt follows default. The argument swept the shaken empire with such force that the greatest Christian mind of the age, a bishop in Roman Africa, son of that sunlit province this series walked at its noon, spent 13 years writing the answer. A vast book arguing that Rome was never the point, that every earthly city, Rome included, rises and falls by the ordinary gravity of human sin and time, and that the only city with foundations was not of this world at all. This series takes no side between the burnt offering and the book. Both are belief, and both are framed here as such. But it marks, as history, what the exchange itself reveals, that on the morning after 410, both faiths, pagan and Christian alike, needed a theology of the fall of Rome. Nobody argued the premise. The eternal city's mortality was now the common ground. Alaric himself outlived his sack by months. He marched his people south, aiming, the sources say, for Africa and its grain. The only prize that could truly feed a nation was turned back by storms at the strait, sickened, and died in the toe of Italy. And his people, so the famous account goes, diverted a river, buried their king in its bed with the spoils of Rome, turned the waters back over him, and killed the enslaved diggers so the place would never be known. It never has been. This series files the tale where it files the she-wolf, legend wrapped around a truth, and notes only the poetry history itself supplied. The man who took the eternal city lies, if the story holds, under a river. The one grave this series' oldest motif could have designed for him. Now the chapter must come down, as this series always comes down, from kings to the road, because the true face of these years was never the throne rooms. It was the traffic. We may picture one family on the Great South Road, the Queen of Roads herself, the Appian, whose stones have carried everything in this story. Legions outbound, treasure home, the crosses of the great slave rising, and now this, in the weeks after the sack. A household of the middling sort, a notary's family, say. The man of it dead or lost in the confusion, so it is the woman who walks at the head. Her mother on the one mule, 3 children, an old enslaved nurse who is family in every sense the law never recognized, a handcart with the strongbox, the lares from the household shrine wrapped in a blanket, or the house's small silver cross. This series does not need to decide, for both walked that road that autumn, side by side. The road itself is what it has always been, perfectly bedded, perfectly cambered, indifferent. The milestones still counting the distance from a golden marker in a forum that no longer rules anything, and the family walks it south among hundreds like them, past villas shuttered or burned, past a way station working as if nothing has happened, selling bread at triple price, past a country chapel where a deacon ladles soup to all comers and does not ask their gods. Refugees of Rome, the phrase itself, to anyone raised in this series, a contradiction. Refugees came to Rome, that was the whole point of her. Walking on Rome's own best road, using the very engineering of the piece to flee the piece's failure. At the crest where a traveler of Part 1 once stood, looking back at the temples on the hills, looking forward down the road to Carthage and the world. The woman stops the cart a moment, because everyone stops there. It is where you can see the city last. The children look back at the smoke haze. The grandmother will not look. And then they walk on south, toward Africa if the boats are kind, into the future, which is where, historians report soberly, most of them arrived. For the deepest truth of 410, held against all its thunder, is that the world did not end. The city was ransomed and resumed, the roads filled again. The grain came in late, but came. What ended was the spell. Everyone on that road knew a thing their grandparents had not known, and their descendants would never again not know. That the ring could break, that Rome was mortal, that the cold, this time, was not weather. It was the season changing. And the season had 60 years left to run, 60 years in which the West would lose, province by province, almost everything this series has watched it build, while a handful of remarkable people held the failing house together far longer than the arithmetic allowed. One of them we have already seen carried off in a wagon, the emperor's sister, hostage of the Goths, about to become, by one of the strangest arcs in Roman history, a Gothic queen, then an empress of Rome, then the ruler, in fact, if never in name, of the whole falling West. Galla Placidia's story is the next chapter's spine, and the next chapter is the one this whole series has been walking toward. The crest of the long dusk, and the quiet, ordinary afternoon on which, at last, it ended. Chapter 4. The Crest and the Dusk. This is the chapter where the Western Roman Empire ends, and before we take one step into it, this series will tell you exactly how it intends to behave. Because the ending of Rome has been told for 15 centuries as thunder, and the truth, which is stranger and sadder and finally more moving, is that it ended the way a tide goes out. No single wave, no last battle worth the name, no burning skyline, a great system growing quieter and smaller and more local, decade by decade, until one afternoon a clerk somewhere filed the paperwork on a fact that had already been true for years. We will not march reign by reign through the puppet emperors of the last decades. This series' oldest discipline, dissolving the minor names into weather, was made for exactly this material, and the outline of the series commanded it here in so many words. We will hold instead to a handful of figures who genuinely carried the age, and first among them, as promised, a woman we last saw carried out of burning Rome in a wagon. Galla Placidia was the daughter of Theodosius, the last ruler of the United Empire, half-sister to both the feeble sons who split it. Raised in the purple, orphaned young, and resident in Rome, in her early 20s, when Alaric's Goths took the city and took her with it. What followed defeats invention. She spent years with the Gothic nation as it wandered, hostage, asset, and increasingly, the sources make clear, something more like a respected principle. And in Gaul, in a ceremony blending both worlds, she married Alaric's successor. The emperor's daughter wed, by all evidence willingly. The hostile source's own embarrassment is our best witness, to the king of the people who had sacked Rome. At the wedding, the accounts record, the king wore Roman dress, and 50 youths carried in the bridal gifts, trays of gold and gems, the plunder of Rome, returned to a daughter of Rome as her marriage portion. And the king himself, a thoughtful man the sources quote directly, had come to a conclusion this series has been arguing for 3 parts. He had meant, he said in substance, to erase Rome and build a Gothic empire in its place, and had learned that his people had laws enough to conquer but not to govern, and so had resolved instead to use Gothic strength to restore the Roman name. The marriage of that sentence to that woman produced a son, a child briefly, in whom Goth and Roman purple ran in one small body, and in him a whole alternative future for the West. Fusion instead of fall. The child died in infancy, in a silver coffin in Barcelona. The king was murdered months later, and the future went back to being the one we know. History turned on that small grave, and this series gives it its sentence of silence. Ransomed back to Ravenna, for grain, the ledger notes. Her brother's court priced her in wheat. She was remarried, against her evident will, to the West's leading general, borne him a son and a daughter, been widowed, quarreled with her brother the emperor, fled with her children to Constantinople, and then, when her brother died childless, returned behind an eastern fleet to install her small son as emperor of the West, and herself, for the 12 years of his minority and in large measure until her death, as the working government of the Western Roman Empire. Let the singularity of it stand plainly. In a state that had never once in 1,200 years of this story admitted a woman to formal rule. The falling West's steadiest hand through its crisis decades was the Augusta Galla Placidia, hostage of the Goths, queen of the Goths, empress of the Romans, mother of the emperor, governing from the marsh city, managing the generals who actually held the armies, balancing them against each other and against her own son's throne, buying with treaty and marriage and patience what the West no longer had legions to take. The fuller portrait, as with all this series' women, belongs to the companion telling. Here, hold the shape of the ark itself, carried out of Rome as plunder, and ending as very nearly the last ruler of Rome worth the word, and hold her, because this chapter will end in a small building she built, now the world she was holding, told as the tide it was. The West's losses in these decades were not battles, they were subtractions. Britain had already gone, not conquered, released. The legions withdrawn for continental civil wars and never returned. And when the island's cities wrote asking for help against raiders, the emperor's chancery sent back the letter tradition remembers as the end of Roman Britain. Look to your own defenses. 3.5 centuries of the Roman island, the wall, the villas, the letters about socks and birthday parties, ended not with a sack, but with an unanswered petition. Within 2 generations the towns were grassing over, and Britain fell out of the Roman world's news, keeping, hold this for the legacy chapters, a memory of itself that would grow strange and golden, and in the fullness of time, produce a once and future king. Gaul and Spain, meanwhile, filled with the settled nations, Goths in the southwest under the treaty Placidia's marriage had sealed, Burgundians on the Rhone, Franks in the north, each holding their lands as Roman federates in name and as kingdoms in growing fact, tax registers and Roman landlords persisting under new management. The empire not so much destroyed in these provinces as sublet. And then the loss that broke the arithmetic. The Vandals, a nation that had crossed the frozen Rhine a generation before in the great cold winter the frontier never recovered from, passed through Gaul, through Spain, and then, under a king of genuine dark genius, did what no barbarian nation had conceived, built a fleet, crossed the Strait of Africa, and took the one province the West could not live without. Africa, the sunlit market town province of the golden afternoon, the grain and oil and taxes that fed Rome and paid whatever army the West still had, was gone in a decade. The ancient world's food supply had been the West's aorta, and it was cut. Everything after Africa is epilogue with a sword in its hand. The Western state now literally could not afford itself. Its remaining armies were federate contingents fighting for pay and land. And its government's real business, for 30 years, was managing the speed of its own subsidence. Into that world, at mid-century, came the storm this series promised to meet properly. Attila. The Huns, since the Shockwave chapter, had consolidated on the great Hungarian plain into an empire of their own, a hegemony of the steppe over dozens of subject nations, extorting from Constantinople by raid and treaty tons of gold a year, and under Attila, sole ruler after his brother's convenient death, that hegemony turned west. This series will render him honestly against both his legends, not the slavering ogre of medieval nightmare, nor the noble savage of romantic reaction, the sources that actually met him, and one remarkable Roman ambassador's memoir survives that did, describe a short, watchful, plainly dressed man who drank from a wooden cup while his captains drank from gold, master of a court thick with Roman secretaries and Gothic kings, terrifying precisely because he was not wild. He was a system, a calculated apparatus of tribute and terror, and the scourge of God. The title is the Church's, coined in the age's own belief that so vast a punishment must be heaven's instrument, was above all a businessman of catastrophe. His invasion of the West, when it came, gave the dying empire its last great battle and its strangest alliance. On the plains of Gaul, the last Roman field army of the West, commanded by the general history, calls the last of the Romans, whose own career had begun as a boy hostage among these same Huns. This series lets his name rest, stood in line of battle beside the Gothic kingdom's full strength, Rome and her sackers shoulder to shoulder against the steppe, and won, the Gothic king dying in the charge, one of the last great victories over which the name of Rome would ever preside in the West. Attila came again the next year, into Italy itself, took and erased the city of Aquileia so thoroughly that its refugees, fleeing into the coastal lagoons, helped seed in those tidal shallows the settlements that would one day become Venice. The next 1,000 years of Mediterranean history seeded, in passing, by the terror of this one, and was met, on the road to defenseless Rome, by an embassy out of the city led by its bishop, the Pope Leo, and turned back. The Christian legend gave the moment the apostles themselves, flaming swords above the pontiff's head. The drier reckoning gives it plague in the Hun column, failing forage, an eastern army moving on his rear, and gold. This series reports both registers, as ever, and notes only the picture that the age itself never forgot. The unarmed bishop riding out from the indefensible city and the storm turning. Because in that picture, whatever its mechanics, the future division of labor is already visible. The emperors could no longer protect Rome. The church, increasingly, was who rode out. Attila died within the year, on a wedding night of a hemorrhage, the age's most feared man dead of a nosebleed in his sleep, and his empire, a personal apparatus to the last, shattered among his sons within a decade and blew back into the steppe like weather. And Rome herself. 3 years after the storm turned, she was sacked again, this time from the sea, by the Vandal fleet out of captured Africa, and this time for 14 days, methodically. The second sack receives its plain sentences, that it was longer and far more thorough than Alaric's. The imperial palaces stripped to the roof tiles, the temple treasures of Jerusalem, spoils of a sack 3 centuries older, carried off in the holds to Carthage, history rhyming pitilessly with itself. But again, by negotiation with the same Bishop Leo, largely unburned and unmassacred. The age was even growing, if the word can be born, professional about it. The empresses and princesses were carried to Africa with the plunder. The West, after that, kept the name of empire the way a great family ruined keeps the house. For 20 more years, emperors were made and unmade in Ravenna and Rome, 8 or 9 of them, and this series now keeps its oldest vow at the exact place the outline set it. They dissolve, here and finally, into the phrase they had already become in their own time. A series of names crowned and discarded by the generals who actually ruled, the real power passing between warlords of Federate blood who could not wear the purple themselves, the prejudice held even now, and so wore emperors instead, like signet rings. The forum's voice still met and still spoke. The Senate of Rome, incredibly, was never abolished and never stopped convening through any of this. But it spoke, as it had for centuries now, to ratify. The eagle still stood on such standards as were still paid for, but the hands that held them were the nations. The roads still ran everywhere, carrying less every year. The machine was all still there. It was simply, quietly, running down, and everyone important had stopped pretending otherwise, which is why the actual end, when it finally came, made so little noise that half the world did not notice it had happened. It came like this, and this series will give it the plain, low telling it has been saving. In the year we count as 476 after the birth of Christ, more than 15 centuries ago now, and the last date the main story of this series will ever fix, the general of the moment in Italy, a professional soldier of frontier nation blood like all his kind, quarreled with his current emperor's father over the oldest currency of the century, land for the Federate troops. The quarrel went the usual way. The father was hunted down and killed, and on the throne in Ravenna there remained only the son, a boy in his early teens, a figurehead's figurehead, whom his father had crowned the year before, and whom history remembers by a name so freighted that no novelist would dare invent it. Romulus, the founder's own name, the boy of the wolf and the furrow, called by the world, in the diminutive his unimportance earned him, Romulus Augustulus, Little Romulus, the little Augustus. The first name of the story and the first name of the empire, both at once in miniature, on the head of a frightened teenager in a marsh city. The general, and here's the hinge, the thing that makes this afternoon the ending rather than one more palace coup, did not kill him and did not replace him. He deposed the boy, pensioned him. A generous pension, the sources note, 6,000 gold pieces a year, and a villa in the soft country south of Naples, a palace built centuries before by a Republican grandee, where the boy emperor disappears from history into what appears to have been a long, quiet, entirely private life. The last emperor of the West, alone in this series' whole gallery of emperors, was permitted to simply grow old. And then the general did the new thing. He declined to manufacture a successor. He gathered the imperial regalia of the West, the diadem, the purple, and sent them east, to Constantinople, to the other emperor, with a message from himself and a compliant Roman Senate, whose substance the sources preserve. One emperor sufficed for the world. The West no longer required its own. Let the Eastern throne hold the whole title, and let him, the general, govern Italy as its king and the emperor's nominal deputy. The East, after a pause for form's sake, essentially agreed. And that was all. No battle, no burning. The Chancery adjusted its formulas. The Senate met as usual. The grain, such as it was, came in. In the villages of Italy that autumn, it is entirely likely that most people never heard the news at all, and that those who heard it could not say exactly what, in practical terms, it meant. Because in practical terms it meant almost nothing, and that is the precise size of the tragedy. The Western Roman Empire had become a thing whose absence changed nobody's Tuesday. The armies were already the nations. The provinces were already kingdoms. The purple had been a costume for decades. On an ordinary afternoon in Ravenna, someone finally said so out loud, in writing, and sent the costume east. And the thing this whole series has been about. The state of Romulus and Cincinnatus, and the Gracchi, of Caesar and Augustus and Marcus. The ring, the eagles, the peace, ended in the West, not with a cry, but with a filing. And so the question is answered, the one this series raised over a pyre in the Forum at the end of Part 1, and has carried through every chapter since. Can a system built on this scale, resting on this many compromises, on conquest and law together, on the enslaved and the citizen, on eagles that obey men and men who obey nothing, endure forever? The West's answer, 12 centuries in the making, came back on that Ravenna afternoon, and it was, no, not forever, not like this. Hold the answer gently, though, and hold it with both hands, because it is only half an answer. In the East, this same year, the other Rome, richer, walled, unbroken, rules on from Constantinople exactly as before, and will for 1,000 years more. And even here in the fallen West, as the legacy chapters will now show, astonishingly little of what Rome actually was. The law, the language, the roads, the church shaped like the empire, the very idea actually stopped. The empire of the West did not shatter. It dissolved. And dissolved things do not vanish. They enter the solution. All Europe ever after is the solution. But that is for the morning, and this chapter is owed its nightfall, and this series has kept, for exactly this page, the place it has been saving since the outline was first drawn. Because Galla Placidia, who died a quarter century before that Ravenna afternoon and was spared the sight of it, built, in the years of her rule, in the marsh capital, a small building that still stands, and it is, by common consent, one of the most beautiful rooms surviving from the entire ancient world. And it is where this series will put the Western Empire to bed. Come there now. No reconstruction is needed. You may buy a ticket tonight, for the room is real and open in the quiet Ravenna back street where it has stood for more than 15.5 centuries. From outside it is nothing, a small plain cross of rose-colored brick, low in the grass. The marsh ground has risen around it, dwarfed by its own reputation. You stoop through the door, and the dark takes a moment, and then the room happens to you, as it has been happening to visitors since the Caesars. Every surface above the marble, every vault, every lunette, the whole small heaven of the place, is mosaic, deep midnight blue, and across the blue, everywhere, stars. Ranks upon ranks of gold stars, circling a golden cross at the crown of the dome. The whole firmament of them glittering in the light of the little alabaster windows, as if the builder had roofed the room with the night sky itself, and set it burning. Doves drink at a golden bowl. Deer come down through gold acanthus to the water. The good shepherd sits among his sheep in a meadow of gold, young and beardless in a purple robe, a Roman empress's idea of heaven, built by Roman hands with the empire coming down around them, out of the oldest images this series knows. The flock, the water, the shepherd on the green hill, which is where a boy, a dog, sheep in the dawn on the Palatine, the whole story began. Stand under those stars a moment, in the small blue dark, in the room a woman built while she held the falling West together, and hear how quiet it is. the quiet of a thing finished. The empire that raised this room is gone, was going even as the gold went up, and the room does not care. It has outlasted the empire, the kingdoms that followed, and every power since, and it will be here. Stars burning in the dark. Long after tonight's listeners are stories too. That is the dusk of Rome, truly told. Not the sack, not the filing in Ravenna. This, the lights going out across a world, and here and there in the gathering dark, small rooms of stars that refuse. Sleep now, if sleep is near. The main story of this series, 12 centuries, from the hut villages by the ford to the folded purple, is told, and its question is answered, and the boy Romulus, first and last, has left the stage. What remains, and it turns out that nearly everything remains, is the long, strange, luminous afterlife, the other Rome reigning on toward its own far horizon. The laws and the language and the roads sinking into Europe like rain into ground, and the eternal city herself, learning her truest trick of all, how to outlive her own fall. The dusk is done, the legacy begins, and the river, need it be said, is still moving. Chapter 5. Legacy 1. What remained. The morning after an empire is a strange country, and this chapter is a walk through it, a long, brightening walk, because the honest news of this chapter, after the long dusk, is almost shockingly good. Rome did not vanish. Very little of what Rome actually was, as opposed to who ruled it, stopped at all. The chapter before last called the West's ending a dissolving, and promised that dissolved things enter the solution. This chapter is the tasting of the solution. We will walk through what remained, the other empire, the law, the languages, the church, the stones, and the idea, and we will end standing under something Roman, in the present tense, in the sunlight. The tempo of this series lifts now, gently, for the first time since the golden afternoon. It has earned it. So have you. Begin in the East, because the largest thing that remained is the one the Western tradition spent centuries training itself to forget, the Roman Empire. Not a memory of it, not a successor. The thing itself, unbroken. The eastern half, ruling on from Constantinople, which never fell in the 5th century, never dissolved, never missed a tax season. Its people did not call themselves Byzantines. That name is a scholar's label, invented 1,000 years later, and this series uses it only under protest. They called themselves, in Greek, Romaioi, Romans, and they were right. The state was Augustus's state in unbroken legal succession, senate and consuls and codes, the eagles on the standards, the emperor, the emperor. When the Western regalia arrived in that box from Ravenna, Constantinople did not experience the fall of Rome. It experienced an administrative consolidation, and within 2 generations, it produced the reign that gathers half this chapter into one lifetime. Justinian, a Balkan soldier's nephew, the last emperor to think wholly in Latin, who looked west at the lost half and made the only serious attempt in history to simply take it all back. His generals retook Africa from the Vandals in a single stunning year. The treasures of Jerusalem, looted from Rome's sack of the temple and re-looted in the Vandal sack of Rome, changing hands a 3rd time and sent to Constantinople, history rhyming to the last. Then Italy itself, in a generation-long war so ruinous that it did what no barbarian ever had, broke the back of Italian antiquity. Rome, besieged and counter-besieged, her aqueducts cut at last by the fighting, shrank in those decades to a fraction of herself. The Reconquest, honestly entered in the ledger, destroyed more of old Rome than the sacks did. The Western recovery did not hold past Justinian's century. Two things he made held longer than empires. The first is a building. In Constantinople, after riots gutted the old cathedral, Justinian raised in 5 years the Church of the Holy Wisdom, Hagia Sophia, a dome 100 feet across, floated on ringed half-domes over a single vast interior of gold mosaic and colored marble, so far beyond anything attempted before, that the emperor at its dedication, tradition says, cried out that he had outdone Solomon, and it stands tonight. Earthquakes and 15 centuries notwithstanding, in the city now called Istanbul. Church for 900 years, then mosque, then museum, then mosque again, and in every century the building other buildings are measured against. The Pantheon in the west, Hagia Sophia in the east. The two unbroken domes of this series, both still standing over their cities, both still doing their work. Hold them as this chapter's first proof that remained is not a metaphor. The second is the law. And here this chapter pays the oldest debt in this entire series. Justinian ordered the whole 1,000-year accumulation of Roman law, the statutes, the edicts, the layered case wisdom of the great jurists, a hoard grown so vast no lawyer could hold it. Digested, reconciled, and codified. One authoritative body of civil law in a few volumes, with a beginner's textbook at the front. The work took his commissioners under a decade, and it is, by any sane measure, among the most consequential books ever assembled. Because 5 centuries later, in the young universities of medieval Italy, scholars took up that code and began to teach it. And from those lecture halls, Roman law flowed back out across Europe a second time, without a single legion, absorbed into the law of the continent and carried by the continent to the world. So that tonight, the civil law of most of Europe, of Latin America, of great stretches of Africa and Asia, descends by direct textual line from Justinian's volumes, which descend from the jurists of the Golden Afternoon, which descend from the praetors of the Republic, which descend from 12 bronze tablets nailed up in the forum so that a plebeian could know the rules. The longest unbroken thread in this series, and the payoff of a promise made in Part 1, Chapter 3. That among Rome's greatest exports, in the very long run, would be not her legions, but this idea. It was. It is. If you have ever signed a contract, made a will, or assumed that the law is written down where you can read it, you have handled Roman goods, and the Eastern Empire that made the code sailed on, and this series will render its 1,000 further years in the dissolving mode, as the outline commands, a millennium in a paragraph. Because the deep telling belongs to another series, and the shape is what this one needs. It weathered, in its first centuries alone, blows that make the 5th century look gentle. Plague on the scale of the medieval Black Death. Persia at the very walls. Then, out of Arabia, the rise of Islam, which in a single astonishing century took from the empire forever its richest provinces, Syria, Egypt, Africa, the old sunlit granaries, and twice besieged Constantinople itself. And the empire, halved and halved again, did not fall. It reorganized, Greek now in speech and utterly Roman in self-understanding, and endured. Brilliant under some dynasties, desperate under others, its gold coin the trusted money of 1,000 medieval years. its scholars copying and recopying the Greek classics through the centuries that the West could not read them. Nearly every Greek author you have ever heard of survives in great part because those copyists did that work. Wounded worst, the ledger records with special plainness, not by any infidel, but by fellow Christians. The Western Crusaders who, 2.5 centuries before the end, took and sacked Constantinople itself. The bronze horses of its hippodrome standing tonight over the door of St. Mark's in Venice as the receipt. It recovered even that, diminished, and dwindled in its last 2 centuries, to little more than the great city itself behind its unconquered triple walls, until, in the spring of the year 1453, more than 5.5 centuries ago now, and the last date this series will ever fix, a young Ottoman sultan brought against those 1,000-year walls the one argument they had never met, the great siege cannon of the New Age, and after 7 weeks, the walls that had turned back the Huns, the Avars, the Persians, and the armies of Islam's first fire were breached at last. And the last emperor, bearing, by history's closing symmetry, the founder's own name, Constantine, the 11th of it, refused evacuation, took off the imperial insignia, and died fighting in the breach as a soldier, his body never certainly found. And the Roman Empire, the state whose birth legend this series dated to a furrow plowed in 753 before Christ, ended at last entirely on a Tuesday morning in May 1453 after Christ. Stand still at that number, because this series planted a measuring stick 2 full parts ago at the Empire's high noon and promised to come back and read it. And this is the reading. From the traditional furrow to the fall of the wall, the Roman state ran 2,200 years, and even counting only from the Republic's birth, or only from Augustus, the span dwarfs almost everything. Only the longest Chinese imperial traditions keep it company. Say the planted words one last time, unhedged now and fully paid for. The Roman state was one of the longest continuities of state, law, and imperial identity the world has ever known. A person alive at the end could stand in a legal and institutional tradition continuous with the world of Cincinnatus. That is the measurement. This series takes down the stick. Now come back west into the fallen half and watch the strangest part of the whole legacy. How much of Rome survived precisely by ceasing to notice it had died? Start with the words in your own mouth. Latin, the tongue this series has followed since it was the dialect of one river plain, did not die with the West. It did something far more interesting. It kept being spoken by everyone every day in the market and the kitchen and the field, and, unpoliced now by any capital, it drifted, as all living speech drifts, differently in each of the old provinces, generation by generation, until, a few centuries along, the drift crossed the line where a traveler noticed. The speech of Gaul and the speech of Spain and the speech of Italy were no longer accents of one language but daughters of it. We call the daughters the Romance languages. The name means simply the Roman ways of speaking, and they are tonight the native tongues of many hundreds of millions of human beings. Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, French, Romanian, that last one still bearing, as this series noted at Trajan's column, the empire's own name, and every one of them is late Latin, grown up and gone its own way. A Spanish grandmother tonight, saying agua for water, is pronouncing what a legionary's wife said at a Spanish fountain under Augustus. changed only as rivers change. And English, the language of this series, a Germanic tongue from beyond the old frontier, was so flooded by Latin, through the Church and through French, that a vast share of its word hoard, above all its learned and formal registers, is Roman cargo. Street and wall and wine came with the legions themselves. City, law, empire, virtue, republic came with the clerks and the friars. And a listener tonight cannot narrate Rome's fall in English without speaking Rome's language in most of the sentence. Then the Church, and here the legacy chapter simply harvests what chapter 2 of this part planted. When the Western state dissolved, the Church shaped like the state did not. The map of dioceses held when the map of provinces failed. The bishop, in city after city, was the last Roman official left standing, and became, feeding the poor from the Church's lands, ransoming captives, negotiating with the kings, the de facto heir of the toga. Latin lived on as the Church's tongue, which meant the schools lived, which meant literacy lived, which meant in the scriptoria of the monasteries, that other great survival engine, where monks under a Roman senator's rule of life copied not only Scripture but Cicero, Virgil, Livy. The entire literature this series has quoted survived the centuries when almost no one else could preserve anything. Nearly every Latin author now existing passed through those copying halls. The Wolf and the Twins reached you tonight because a monk in Charlemagne's century had good ink. And at the structure's head, the bishops of Rome, inheriting the old capital as emperors, abandoned it, riding out to Attila when no one else would, taking up in time the very title Pontifex Maximus that Augustus had worn. Built on the empire's pattern and out of the empire's ruins, the single institution that connects that world to this one without a break. A Roman office, elected tonight by methods a late antique cleric would recognize, in a city where its holder still, on solemn occasions, speaks Latin from a balcony to a square laid out over Nero's circus. Whatever one believes, and this series, to its last page, frames all belief as belief. The institutional fact is not arguable. Among the oldest working organizations on earth is a piece of the Roman Empire that declined to stop. And the stones. This series has been keeping its present tense promise all along. The drain under the Forum, the walls, the Pantheon. And here the promise pays in full, plainly, because rule and rhetoric agree for once. The old world is still physically present, and you can go and touch it. The roads first, as ever. The Queen of Roads still runs from Rome's gate. Her original stones bare for miles under the pines, walkable this evening. And across Europe the network never stopped working. Medieval pilgrims walked it. Early modern posts galloped it. And the modern highways of half a dozen nations lie over the Roman line so exactly that a map of motorways is, in stretch after stretch, a map of the legions surveying. Aqueducts still stand across 3 continents. One still delivers water to the fountains of Rome tonight, including the Trevi, so that a coin thrown there this evening lands in water brought by a channel of Augustus's oldest friend. Bridges of the legions still carry traffic, 2,000 years of feet and now of trucks. The walls of Aurelian still ring the old city. London, Paris, Vienna, Cologne, Barcelona, and 100 more of Europe's cities stand on Roman street grids, their cathedral quarters over the old forums, and the amphitheaters, Nimes, Arles, Verona, still fill on summer nights, with opera now, and bullfights and rock concerts, 50,000 people in Roman seats. The crowd roar rising out of the same stone bowl, everything the same but the show, which is, this series submits, the entire moral of the legacy chapters in a single image. One survival remains, the strangest, the least material, and the one that makes the last part of this chapter necessary. The idea, the title, Rome as the name of legitimate supreme power itself. Because the peoples who inherited the West never concluded that the empire was a dead thing. They concluded, almost unanimously, that it was a vacant thing, a throne, not a tomb. And for 13 centuries after the filing in Ravenna, the West's history is punctuated by hands reaching for it. The first and greatest reach, on Christmas morning, 3¼ centuries after the last Western emperor in the old Basilica of St. Peter in Rome, the Pope set a crown on the head of the King of the Franks. Charlemagne, master by then of most of the old Western provinces, and the packed church acclaimed him, in the old formula, Augustus and Emperor of the Romans. The Western title, dormant since the box went east, deliberately revived. To Constantinople's cold and lasting fury, for the actual Roman Empire was still very much in session and had not been consulted. From Charlemagne's crown descends the whole strange lineage, the Holy Roman Empire, which organized the German lands for 1,000 years, of which a French wit observed, in the joke every survey of history is required by law to repeat, that it was neither holy, nor Roman, nor an empire, and yet it outlived him and nearly everything else, dissolving only in the age of Napoleon, who promptly crowned himself emperor in his turn with Roman eagles on the standards and Roman fasces on the coins. And eastward, after 1453, the rulers of Moscow, married into the last Byzantine dynasty, took up the double-headed eagle and the claim of the Third Rome, and called themselves by the word this series planted at the pyre in Part 1. Tsar, which is Caesar. As the German emperors into living memory were Kaiser, which is Caesar, so that when the 20th century opened, the two greatest thrones of continental Europe both bore, as their ordinary working title, the family name of an indebted Roman politician assassinated 19½ centuries before. Every one of these, this series files precisely as the outline directs. Reachings back, not continuations, costume, however consequential, borrowed from a wardrobe whose owner died in 1453. But the reaching itself, 13 centuries of it, is the historical fact this chapter ends on. Nothing in the West could feel fully legitimate for over a millennium without touching Rome. The empire's last conquest was the imagination of its heirs. Now the chapter keeps its final promise and goes outside, into the present tense, into the sun. No reconstruction marker needed, for nothing here is reconstructed. You can stand in this set piece yourself, this year if you like, in the south of France, an hour from Avignon, where the river Garden comes green and cold out of the limestone hills. You walk up through holm oak and thyme, cicadas, dust, the smell of hot stone, and the path turns, and it is simply there, across the whole sky of the valley. The Pont du Gard, the great aqueduct bridge of Roman Nimes, 3 tiers of golden arches, 160 feet of them, 19 centuries old, carrying nothing now but its own perfection, and so vast that the people on the walkway are specks and the swallows hunting the arches are dust. Stand under the middle tier, where the shade falls cool, and put your hand on a block, laid without mortar, gripping by weight and precision alone. The crane sockets and the mason's setting marks still crisp in the stone. Roman numerals chalked in permanence by hands 18 centuries gone. And listen. The river below, the cicadas, and above you, French and Spanish and Italian voices calling to their children. The legion's Latin, softened by 80 generations, echoing off the legion's engineering, neither one aware of the reunion. This series has said many hard, true things about the power that built this, has counted its slaves, its arenas, its burned cities, and will not unsay a word under any arches whatsoever. But it is also promised, from the first chapter, that the old world is still here, that this is not a story about a vanished planet, but about the deep floor of the one you are standing on. And here, with your palm on the warm stone, and the water channel running dry and perfect over your head, toward a city that still uses its Roman name, the promise is kept in full. What remained? You are touching it. It remained. One chapter now, only one, and it is not about what Rome left in the world, for that account is closed. It is about what Rome left in the mind, the legend of her own eternity, the wolf who began our story waiting at its end, the letters SPQR still riding tonight on the manhole covers of a living city, and the walk this series has owed you from the beginning. Back through everything one last time, down to the river, in the dark. Let us go and finish it. Chapter 6, Legacy 2, The Eternal City. This is the last chapter, and it keeps the oldest promises. There is nothing left to conquer and no one left to crown. The history is told, and the ledger is closed and balanced. What remains for this final hour is the thing the Romans themselves said would remain when everything else had gone. They had a name for it, and the name is the chapter. Roma Aeterna, the Eternal City. We will spend this chapter asking gently what that phrase turned out to mean, weighing the legend against the ground one final time, as we did when the story began. And then we will take the walk this series has owed you since its first page. Back through the whole journey, motif by motif, down through the modern city to the river in the evening. There is no rush. There was never any rush. That was the point all along. Eternal was the Romans' own word, and they meant it. And this series, which has hedged every superlative for 9 hours, can report with a clear conscience that it is the one Roman boast history has, so far, declined to falsify. The poets of Augustus's court called Rome the Eternal City, while the marble was still wet. The phrase went onto the coins, into the law codes, into the state's own prayers. Even the Christians, who of all people had theological reasons to refuse it. The greatest of them wrote 13 years of refusal. This series watched him do it. Ended by baptizing the phrase instead, Rome the Eternal, now of the Apostles. And here's the strange finding of the long run. The emperors who stamped eternal on the coins were wrong about everything they meant by it. The empire fell, the games ended, the gods changed, and the word came true anyway, in the one register no one intended. The city is still there, not a ruined field with a modern town beside it, the fate of Babylon and Memphis. Not a name moved to a new site. The same city, on the same 7 hills, at the same ford of the same river, continuously inhabited, continuously itself, from the hut villages of our first chapter to the traffic outside its cafes tonight. Very nearly 3,000 years, holding through everything this series has narrated and the 15th century since. The sacks, the fall, the malaria ages when she shrank to a village of 30,000 grazing goats in the Forum, the returns, the Renaissance popes quarrying the Colosseum for palaces, the unifications, the occupations. In the 20th century, she passed 1 million inhabitants again, for the first time since the era this series called her high noon. And tonight, she holds nearly 3 on the old ground, at the old crossing. Few cities of such antiquity, anywhere on earth, have done quite this. The Pharaoh's cities are archaeology. Athens is glorious, but was, for long stretches, small. Constantinople lives mightily, but under another name, and flag, and faith. Rome is simply, still, Rome. Whatever the augurs saw from that hilltop, whatever the geese and the entrails and the flights of birds were worth, the oldest claim on the ledger cleared. This series marks it paid and moves, smiling a little on. And the proof is not in monuments. It is in the street furniture. And here this chapter delivers the small, perfect fact it has been saving for 9 hours. Cast into the iron of the manhole covers of modern Rome, the ordinary drain lids that Romans step over tonight on their way to dinner, that taxis rattle across by the 10,000, are 4 letters, SPQR, Senatus Populusque Romanus, the Senate and people of Rome, the official name of the Roman state, the formula of the Republic of the Fathers, the letters the legions carried on their standards from Scotland to the Euphrates. Still tonight the official insignia of the municipal government of the city of Rome, on the buses, the fountains, the paychecks of the sanitation department, and the drains. 25 centuries after the plebeians walked out to the sacred mount to force those words to mean something, the words are underfoot in the living city, doing municipal work, and almost nobody looks down. This series has quoted emperors and read the stars over battlefields, and it submits, at the end, that no monument in this whole story says what that drain lid says, that Rome never experienced herself as ending, that the city simply kept the stationary. Underfoot is, in fact, the truest direction in Rome, and before the final weighing, take 1 page to look down, because the eternal city's deepest secret is that she is stacked. Rome does not stand beside her past. She stands on it, floor upon floor, and you can descend through the floors tonight. There is a church in the city where you enter at street level into the 12th century. Take a stair down into the 4th. The first basilica, frescoed and hushed, and then a further stair down into the 1st. A Roman alley, a Roman house, and in it a shrine of Mithras, the soldier's god, altar and benches intact, with the sound, this is the detail every visitor keeps, of running water somewhere in the dark beyond the wall. A spring or drain of the Republic's era, still flowing, still audible, under 2 churches and 20 centuries. Rome is that stair everywhere. The Renaissance palace with the theater of Pompey curved in its cellar walls. The very theater, listeners of Part 1, at whose statue Caesar fell. The church floors of ancient porphyry sliced from imperial columns. The apartment buildings with a temple podium in the parking garage. The past is not preserved in Rome the way a museum preserves, pinned, labeled, apart. It is load-bearing. The city is her own strata, alive on top of herself, and the eternity of the eternal city turns out to be geological. Not that nothing fell, but that everything that fell became a floor. Now the last weighing, the one this series promised in its second chapter and has kept in trust for 9 hours. We began with 2 stories of Rome's beginning, the wolf and the twins, and the post holes in the hillside, the legend and the ground. It is time to close that frame, standing now at the story's far end where all the evidence is finally in. The ground story, told start to finish, runs. Villages by a ford grew together because the crossing was good. They prospered by soil and salt and stubbornness. They built a republic out of fear of kings, an empire out of the republic's wreckage, and a peace out of the empire's exhaustion. The peace ran 2 centuries, frayed for one, transformed for another, and the western half subsided into its successors, while the eastern half sailed on 1,000 years. Every step of it explicable, human, unblessed. Geography, greed, genius, luck, and grief in the proportions this series has weighed all along. Not one wolf is required. And yet, here is the finding. The legend story, wolf and all, told the deeper truth about what Rome believed she was. And belief, this series has learned across 3 parts, is also a historical force, perhaps the strongest one we have handled. The Romans chose a founding story of exposure and rescue, the abandoned who survived, suckled by the wild, taking in Sabines and slaves and strangers, and they built, believing it, one of history's most absorptive states. The open door that this series tracked from the asylum on the Capitoline Hill to citizenship for every free soul in the known world. They chose a story with a fratricide at the foundation, Remus dead at the wall, and were honest enough to keep it, and it kept them honest. Through Gracchi and prescriptions and Caesar and every civil war, Romans said to each other it began with brothers' blood, a founding myth that worked like a conscience. The legend was false as fact and true as testament. It did not record what Rome was. It recorded what Rome intended, feared, and became. That is this series' last word on the oldest question in it. The wolf never lived. The wolf was real. Both held together, the listener knows the refrain by now, are Rome. And so, the walk. Everything is told. The frame is closed. There remains only the promise made before the first chapter was written, that at the very end, this series would go back through the whole journey in the company of its 4 oldest companions, in their fixed and ancient order, the Tiber, the road, the eagle, and the forum's voice. We will take it as an evening walk through the living city. You may take the identical walk yourself, any evening. Every stone in it is real, starting on the height where the story started, ending at the water. Come. It is the last hour of an autumn day in Rome, the light going amber, the swifts coming out, and there is, one final time, no rush at all. Begin on the Palatine Hill, in the gardens over the ruins, where the guards will soon be calling closing time, because under these very terraces, cut into this rock, are the post holes, the actual hut floors of the actual village, the ones our shepherd boy woke in on the first morning of this series, 3,000 years ago, fire-banked, sheep restless, river fog below. Stand a moment where he stood, and take the first companion, the oldest, the Tiber. There below, exactly where it has always been, going gold in the low sun. The river that carried the twins in the story and the salt in the fact, that received the Gracchi and drowned Maxentius, that fed the largest city in the world through the wharves of the peace and flowed, indifferent, past the pyre of Caesar, the fires of Nero, the entry of Alaric, the one character in this story that appears in every chapter and is wounded in none. Rivers are patient, this series said on its first evening, and empires are temporary, and the whole 9 hours since have been the proof. Everything else in the view from this hill has burned, fallen, or changed its gods at least once. The river has only changed its light. Come down off the hill now, out the gate and walk, and the second companion is under your feet before you think to look for it. The road. Down past the Circus Maximus, out the old south gate through Aurelian's wall, his bricks still rose-colored in the last sun, still ringing the city that never stopped needing it. And there, running out ahead of you between the pines and the tombs, laid bare to its original stones, the Queen of Roads, the Appia, walkable this evening for miles, the basalt polished by 22 centuries of everything this series has set upon it. Walk a few hundred yards of it as far as the light lasts, and let it play its whole part back. The shepherd track by the ford, Appius Claudius spending the treasury, the legions southbound for Carthage and the coffles northbound from it, the 6,000 crosses of the great rising, which this road is owed forever, the couriers of the peace at 50 miles a day, the letter to Britain, the socks, the birthday, the plague riding it, and the Goths, and the refugee family of 410 pausing at this very crest. It is this crest. You are standing on it, for their last sight of the city, the pilgrims after them, the armies after them, the poets after them, and tonight a jogger, 2 tourists, and you. Rome's true monument was never vertical. It was this. The horizontal empire, the idea that any 2 points on Earth ought to be connected, laid down so well that the connection outlived every purpose it was built for. Somewhere north of you, its descendants, the autostrada, the motorway, the interstate, are carrying the evening traffic on the legion's old logic. The road never ended. It just kept going without them. Turn back now, in through the wall as the streetlights come on, and look up, because the third companion was never on the ground. The eagle. There are no legions to carry it. There has been no eagle on a Roman standard for 15 centuries. And yet, if your timing is right on an autumn evening, the Roman sky will hand you its own conclusion. Over the city in the last light, the vast smoke-shaped flocks of starlings that winter in Rome are wheeling, tens of thousands of birds turning as one dark banner over the rooftops, folding, streaming, reforming, exactly the kind of sky sign our story's first augur climbed his hill in the dark to read. Watch them over the domes, and let the eagle's whole flight come back. The grandfather on the hillside reading the evening birds, the augur's staff drawing its quiet rectangle of heaven, Marius bringing the bird down out of the sky onto the standards of the poor, the eagles lost in the German forest and hunted home, the eagle in lamplight in the fort's shrine on the northern river, while 50 million people slept unarmed inside its ring. The eagles turned inward, king-making in the terrible years, and the double-headed heirs on the banners of czars and kaisers, carrying Caesar's name into living memory. The augury that never lands, this series called it once, and it never did land. It flew from religion into war, from war into majesty, from majesty into memory, and tonight it is dissolved back into what it was before Rome was Rome. Actual birds over the actual hills, writing their illegible signs on the evening, and no one below claims to read them anymore. And the city goes to dinner regardless, and perhaps that too is a kind of peace. And the fourth companion, the last. The one this series has always kept for last. The forum's voice. Walk to the railing above the forum itself, at the Capitoline's edge, where the floodlights are coming up on the old center of the world. The broken columns, the arches, the brick core of the speaker's platform, the rostra, the actual platform. Cicero's head and hands were nailed there. The torn toga of Caesar was shown to the crowd there. The Gracchi asked their question there. The whole republic for 5 centuries argued itself into and out of existence within the throw of your voice from where you stand. It is silent now. Perhaps the most eloquent silence in Europe. Tourists murmuring where the assemblies roared. And a listener could be forgiven for ending the walk in elegy. The voice stilled, the argument lost. But this series has tracked this companion too long and too far to leave it there, because the forum's voice was never the stones. It was the idea the stones hosted, that power must argue for itself, out loud, in the open, before the governed, under laws that are written down where everyone can read them. And that idea, the listener of this whole series knows, did not die in this valley. It went out through the law schools of Justinian's code and the council halls of the medieval towns. It is load-bearing tonight in every parliament, senate, congress, and court from this city westward around the earth. Half of them meeting in buildings dressed, not by accident, in this forum's own columns. Every one of them conducting, in its own tongue, the argument that began in a drained marsh at the foot of this hill. How shall we be governed, and who says so, and by what right? The voice is the pulse, this series said in part 1, and promised to keep checking it. Here at the end, then, the last reading. The forum is silent, and the argument it hosted has never been carried by more voices, in more languages, or on more continents. The pulse holds. The argument, Rome's longest bequest, and her most demanding, is yours now, and your children's. It is only ever one generation from silence, which is the last thing the empty rostra have to say, and the most important. So the 4 are walked, and the ritual is kept, and there is only one place left to go. The place this story came from. Come down from the Capitoline in the full dark now, through the evening streets, past the floodlit column of Trajan with its legions still climbing, past the Pantheon's porch, its doors closing, its eye going dark for the night over the one dome, across the drain lids with their 4 faithful letters, down by the old lanes to the embankment, and stop at last on the bridge by the Tiber Island, the ford, the crossing where every step of this began. Lean on the parapet. Below you, the river is running in the dark. You can hear it against the island's old prow of stone. The same water road it was before Rome, before the huts, before the name. Fog rising off it tonight as it rose for the shepherd boy. The reflections of the street lamps riding it as the stars rode it for the augur. The current going down to the sea past the sleeping city exactly as it went when the city was 7 villages, and a republic, and the capital of the earth, and a ruin grazed by goats, and each of the Romes since, carrying, as it has carried all along, the one message this series has been delivering for 9 hours in every voice it could borrow. That everything passes, and that this is not the tragedy it seems, because what passes, if it was built well and honestly witnessed, becomes the floor of what comes next, becomes the road under the traffic, the law under the signature, the Latin under the lullaby, the stars on a chapel ceiling in the marsh dark, the four letters on the drain, the river under the bridge you are standing on. There is no rush here. There never was. The city sleeps behind you 3,000 years deep and will still be there in the morning. The river does not stop and does not need to be watched to keep moving. And you're part of this. The listening, the witnessing, the carrying is complete and was beautifully done. Thank you for walking the whole road. Go gently now and sleep well. The Tiber is still moving. Let it carry you out.